Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily just for you. Megan's heart raced as she led the group along the overgrown path, her flashlight beam bobbing with every uneven step. The old house at the end of Harper Lane had always been a source of local legend, a place spoken of in hushed tones and nervous chuckles. Stories claimed the house had been abandoned for decades, left to rot after its last owner mysteriously disappeared. No one remembered seeing the previous tenants move out. They just stopped appearing around town. And yet, the house never fell completely into disrepair. Its paint stayed just barely chipped, its windows unbroken but grimy, and its roof solid enough to keep out the rain. It was as if time had decided not to bother with it. "This is a bad idea," muttered Kara, her voice a low whisper as they reached the sagging picket fence. She hung back, clutching her jacket close against the cool night breeze. "Oh, come on," Eric said, rolling his eyes. "We've done worse. Remember that abandoned mill with all the rats? This is nothing. Just a creepy house." "That's what makes it worse," Kara shot back. "You know what people say about this place. And you know that people make up stories to freak each other out," Eric said with a grin. He gave her a gentle nudge toward the gate. "We're not going to find anything scarier than a few mice and some dusty furniture. Right, Megan?" Megan hesitated. Unlike Eric, she wasn't so sure. Something about this place felt off. It wasn't just the eerie stories. It was the way the house loomed at the end of the street, its shadow stretching long even under the moonlight. It was the faint scent of mildew on the air, the unnatural stillness that pressed down on them as they approached. But Megan wouldn't let herself back down now. "Let's just check it out quickly," she said. "If it's too weird, we'll leave." Eric pushed the gate open with a creak, the sound startling all of them. Megan noticed that even Eric, with all his bravado, tightened his grip on his flashlight as they stepped through. The lawn was a tangle of weeds and dead grass, the earth soft and damp beneath their sneakers. The house's front door, a heavy wooden slab with an iron knocker shaped like a wolf's head, seemed to lean toward them as if eager to swallow them whole. Megan swallowed hard and forced a small smile. "Okay, in and out, 10 minutes, tops." Eric gave a mock salute. "Yes, ma'am." He reached for the doorknob and twisted. It didn't budge. "Locked," he said, frowning. "Guess that's our excuse to leave," Kara said, her tone more hopeful than sarcastic. But Eric wasn't ready to give up. He crouched by a first-floor window and pried at the cracked frame. With a bit of effort and a sharp snap, it came loose. He turned back to them with a triumphant grin. "And we're in!" Kara groaned, but Megan was already moving toward the window. As she climbed through, she noticed how cold it was inside. The air seemed thicker, heavier. The faint scent of mildew she'd noticed outside was stronger here, tinged with something metallic. The room they entered was bare. No furniture, no decoration, just peeling wallpaper and a floor that creaked ominously with every step. Megan swept her flashlight around and stopped when the beam caught something on the far wall. It looked like scratches deep, jagged gouges that carved through the plaster in uneven patterns. She moved closer to get a better look, her stomach twisting. They weren't random. They almost looked like words, though none she could understand. "Guys," she whispered, "come look at this." Eric and Kara joined her, both falling silent as their flashlights illuminated the scratches. Kara hugged her jacket tighter, whispering, "What the hell did that?" Eric shrugged, though his confidence seemed forced now. "Could have been an animal, raccoon or something." "Raccoons don't write," Megan said, her voice quieter than she intended. The room suddenly felt colder, as though the air itself had turned against them. Kara grabbed Megan's arm, her grip tight. "I don't like this." "We said 10 minutes, Eric said, though he didn't look sure anymore. "Let's check the upstairs and then we'll go. Okay?" Megan nodded slowly. "Okay." But as they moved toward the stairs, she felt it again, that sensation of being watched. She turned back, scanning the room, but saw nothing. Just the gouges in the wall and the faint impression of something moving at the edge of her vision. Megan had always been the curious type. When her friends hesitated at the foot of the staircase, she took the lead, shining her flashlight upward. The steps creaked in protest as she ascended, each groan of the old wood echoing through the empty house. Behind her, Kara muttered nervously, "This place is so much worse than I thought." "Just stick together," Megan replied, though her own voice wavered. She wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure Kara or herself. The second floor was colder than the first. Megan's breath fogged in the dim light, and the air carried a damp metallic tang. Doors lined the hallway, most ajar, revealing empty rooms with cracked ceilings and wallpaper that peeled away in long, curling strips. But one door stood out. It was at the very end of the hallway, slightly recessed into the wall as if trying to go unnoticed. The wood was darker, the surface smoother, and unlike the others, the door was firmly shut. Its brass doorknob gleamed faintly in the weak light, as if it had been polished recently. There was something unnerving about how pristine it looked compared to the rest of the decaying house. "What's up with that one?" Eric asked, pointing his flashlight toward it. "I don't know," Megan said, stepping closer. Her heart thudded louder as she approached, the sound filling her ears. She tried the knob. It was locked, the mechanism refusing to give even a little under her grip. "Maybe we shouldn't," Kara began, but Megan cut her off. "I just want to see what's inside," Megan said, her curiosity overriding her caution. She knelt down and peered at the small keyhole. Her flashlight's beam flickered as she leaned in. For a moment, it looked as if the room beyond was lit. A faint, flickering glow like candlelight seemed to dance on the other side of the door. But when she blinked, the light was gone, replaced by total darkness. "What are you doing?" Eric asked, his tone uneasy. "There's something." Megan trailed off, not sure how to explain what she'd seen. She turned the knob again, more forcefully this time, but it still wouldn't budge. "It's locked." "Good," Kara said quickly. "That's our sign to leave it alone." Megan didn't reply right away. She felt a pull, an irrational but insistent urge to know what was behind that door. The sensation was almost physical, a tightness in her chest, a whisper at the back of her mind urging her to find the key. "Megan," Eric said sharply, "let it go." Reluctantly, Megan stepped back. She told herself it was just a locked room. Nothing unusual about that. But the brass doorknob glinted in the dim light, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the locked door was more than a barrier. It was a threshold, something meant to keep them out, or something in. As the three of them moved on to the other rooms, Megan couldn't help glancing over her shoulder. Even when they were down the hall, she felt the presence of the locked door as if it were watching her, silently daring her to come back. The air grew heavier as Megan stepped into one of the upstairs bedrooms. Her flashlight beam revealed the skeletal remains of a twin-sized bed, its wooden frame splintered and its mattress reduced to a sagging, moldy lump. Dust coated the floorboards, and the walls were covered in torn floral wallpaper that curled at the edges like dried petals. But it wasn't the decay that stopped her in her tracks. It was the mirror. It stood against the far wall, tall and tarnished, its silver backing marred by black spots and fine cracks that ran across its surface like veins. The frame was ornate, curling into intricate patterns of flowers and vines, their once gilded edges now dulled and faded. Megan's flashlight caught a faint glimmer in the glass, and as she stepped closer, her reflection flickered to life. She raised her hand, watching her reflection mimic her movements, but something wasn't right. It wasn't just the grime or the warped surface. The room reflected in the mirror didn't match the room she stood in. Behind her reflection, the wallpaper was whole, the furniture upright and untouched by time. A simple wooden chair sat against the opposite wall, its fabric seat pristine. A white bedspread lay neatly over a clean mattress. It was as though the mirror held a glimpse into the house as it had once been, long before it had fallen into ruin. Megan stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass as she leaned in. "What the hell?" she whispered. "Find something?" Eric called from down the hall. "I think so," she replied, though she wasn't sure what she'd found. Her fingers brushed the frame, and the air around her grew colder. The faint metallic smell from earlier was stronger now. She peered into the mirror again, trying to understand what she was seeing. Her reflection stared back, but it wasn't quite right. Her face seemed off-blurred at the edges, as if her features were smudged. Then out of the corner of her eye, she caught movement. Megan spun around, but the room was empty. She looked back at the mirror. There it was again, something shifting behind her reflection. It wasn't clear at first, just a shadow sliding across the background. She froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Hello," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The shadow moved again. This time it was more distinct. A figure emerged, standing behind her reflection. It was a man. His features were hazy, his face pale and expressionless. He wore old-fashioned clothing, a buttoned vest and a white shirt, and his head tilted slightly as if he were studying her. Megan turned quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was still empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the man was gone. Her reflection was just that, a reflection. The ruined room behind her matched the one she stood in. No pristine wallpaper, no chair, no man. She took a shaky step back, her breath coming in short bursts. The room felt colder now, more oppressive. She didn't want to stay in there any longer, but her feet refused to move. Part of her, the part that had always chased after strange and eerie things, wanted to reach out, to touch the mirror, to see if the image would change again. The rest of her screamed to run. "Megan?" Kara's voice called from the hallway, cutting through the thick silence. "What's going on?" Megan's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm coming." She forced herself to step back from the mirror, her legs trembling as she moved. She kept her flashlight trained on the glass, watching for any flicker of motion. But the mirror remained still, no shadows, no man. Megan stumbled out of the room, joining the others. "This place is seriously messed up," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She didn't mention the man in the mirror. Not yet. She wasn't sure she'd even seen him. Wasn't sure it hadn't been her eyes playing tricks in the dim light. But the uneasy feeling stayed with her, curling deep in her chest like a cold knot. As they moved on, Megan couldn't shake the sensation that the mirror had shown her something it wasn't supposed to, something that didn't want to be seen. And now that she'd seen it, it knew her. By now, Megan had begun to regret coming back to the house. Something was different this time, heavier than before. She could tell Eric was forcing his usual bravado, and Kara had grown quieter, more jumpy, clutching her jacket and refusing to stray far from Megan's side. The whispers that had once been faint suggestions now seemed to crawl under the skin, muttering indistinct phrases just low enough that you couldn't understand them, only feel them. And then there was the study. Megan had stumbled upon it after straying a little ahead of the others, driven by a feeling she couldn't name. The door to the room was ajar, creaking softly as it swayed on its hinges. Her flashlight revealed a space that might once have been elegant. A large oak desk still stood against the wall, though its surface was scarred and weathered. Bookshelves loomed to either side, their shelves sagging under the weight of old, moldering tomes. The air felt heavier here, damp and oppressive. She wasn't sure why she decided to open the desk drawer. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was that strange pull she'd felt since they first entered the house. Whatever it was, her hand was trembling as she tugged it open. Inside was a scattering of yellowed papers, their edges curling and stained. But what caught her attention was the photograph. It was a black and white print, faded but remarkably clear given its age. The image showed a family, 2 adults and 2 children, standing in front of a house. Their house. Megan instantly recognized the distinctive wraparound porch and the sharp, angled roofline. She studied the figures, a stern-looking father with a thick mustache, a woman in a high-collared dress, and 2 children. The boy was maybe 5 or 6, standing stiffly by his father's side. The girl was older, likely Megan's age, and it was her face that made Megan's breath catch. She squinted, bringing the photograph closer to her flashlight. The girl's features, they were eerily familiar. She had the same dark eyes, the same sharp cheekbones. Even the way her hair fell around her shoulders seemed like a mirror of Megan's own. "What the?" she murmured, her voice trailing off. She turned the photograph over, looking for a date, a name, anything. The back was blank, except for one word, scrawled in neat handwriting. "Mine." Megan felt her pulse quicken. She didn't know what it meant, didn't want to know, but she couldn't stop staring at the girl's face. Her reflection in the mirror earlier had been warped and strange, but this felt different. It was her, but it couldn't be. "Megan?" Eric's voice called from down the hall. She quickly shoved the photo into her jacket pocket, almost dropping it as she fumbled. "Yeah!" Coming! Her voice cracked, and she cleared her throat before shouting again. I'll be right there. As she straightened up, her flashlight beam swept across the desk once more, and she froze. Her breath caught in her throat. On the wall behind the desk, something was moving. It wasn't a shadow, not exactly. It was a shape, a pale smudge that seemed to be twisting, stretching against the wallpaper like something trapped behind the surface. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping her flashlight. The shape was faint, but it seemed to pulse, almost in time with the whispers that still buzzed faintly in her ears. And then it stopped. The room went still. The whispers ceased. Kara's voice this time closer, more urgent. Where are you? I'm coming! She shouted, her voice breaking with panic. She forced her legs to move, fleeing the study without a backward glance. When she met the others in the hallway, she avoided their eyes. What happened? Kara asked, her face pale. Nothing, Megan lied, gripping her jacket pocket tightly. Let's keep moving. She said nothing about the photograph, nothing about the shifting figure in the wallpaper. But even as they pressed on, Megan felt the weight of the photograph in her pocket like a stone, pulling her down. She didn't need to look at it again to remember the resemblance. And she didn't need to turn back to know that the whispers had returned. The house seemed to shift as the night deepened. Walls that once seemed stable groaned faintly, and the floorboards felt softer underfoot, as though they'd only just begun to rot. Megan's group moved more cautiously now, their nerves frayed after each strange encounter. The quiet crept in around them, amplifying every small sound, the scuff of a shoe, the faint whistle of wind through a crack in the window frame. No one spoke unless they had to. Each step up the staircase sounded deafening in the otherwise still air. They reached the landing and paused, exchanging wary glances. Megan kept her flashlight moving, its beam slicing through the darkness ahead. Kara, still clutching her jacket like it was the only thing keeping her upright, whispered, "We should turn back." "We just got here," Eric whispered back, his bravado dimmed but not extinguished. "We haven't even gone upstairs yet." "We don't need to," Kara insisted. "There's nothing up there." But Megan wasn't so sure. Her gut told her that something about this house, about these stairs, about the muffled sounds they kept hearing, wasn't nothing. She just couldn't say what it was. So she gripped her flashlight tighter and started up the staircase without waiting for the others. The steps were steep and narrow. Each one groaned under her weight, protesting the intrusion. She focused on her breathing, keeping it slow, and even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Behind her, she heard Eric and Kara follow, their footsteps hesitant. She could almost feel their fear pressing against her back. The darkness above seemed thicker, harder to push through. Every step seemed to amplify the sound of her own pulse in her ears. About halfway up, she froze. A long, low creak echoed through the house, but it hadn't come from beneath her feet. The sound had come from the floor below them. It was slow, deliberate, as though something or someone was walking around on the first floor. The noise stopped, leaving an uneasy silence. "Did you hear that?" Kara whispered sharply, her voice trembling. Eric cleared his throat. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Megan shook her head, her flashlight beam quivering as her hand trembled. No, that wasn't the wind. She whispered the words so quietly that even she barely heard them. Her grip on the railing tightened. She glanced over her shoulder, but the lower floor was lost in shadow. If something was moving down there, it stayed hidden. "We should go back," Kara said again, her voice rising slightly in panic. But Megan couldn't bring herself to turn around. If she went back down, it would feel like surrendering to the thing she hadn't seen, but knew was there. She clenched her jaw and forced herself to take another step upward. The others followed reluctantly, Kara muttering curses under her breath. The second creak came just as they reached the top of the stairs. This time, it wasn't just one step, it was a series of slow, deliberate footsteps. Megan spun around, her flashlight pointed down the stairs. She expected to see something at the bottom, some shape moving in the gloom. But there was nothing. The stairs were empty. The sound continued for a moment, echoing upward, and then it stopped as abruptly as it had started. "Megan," Eric said, his voice barely a whisper, "what are we doing here?" She didn't answer. Her heart pounded against her ribcage, and she could feel the hairs on her arms standing on end. She knew she should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to get out of the house, to run until she was back in the safety of the open air. But the pull she'd felt since the first night was stronger than ever. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something she couldn't explain. The house wanted them here. It wanted her here. The others huddled behind her, their flashlights jittering as their hands shook. No one moved, waiting for the next creak, the next shift in the oppressive quiet. But the silence stretched on, unbroken, and they stood frozen at the top of the staircase. Megan turned back toward the hallway ahead, trying to keep her breathing steady. She forced herself to push forward, taking slow steps into the upper floor. Whatever was below them, whatever had made the sounds on the stairs, was not going to drive her away. Not yet. She needed answers. And somehow, she knew she wouldn't find them downstairs. The hallway stretched ahead, dim and narrow, the walls closing in like they were pressing the air out of the space. Megan's footsteps felt louder now, each scuff of her sneakers on the floorboards echoing down the long corridor. Kara stayed close behind, her grip on Megan's jacket sleeve tight enough to wrinkle the fabric. Eric trailed a few steps behind them, his flashlight bouncing light nervously off the walls. That's when Megan first heard it, a low murmur, so faint it barely registered as sound at all. She froze mid-step, tilting her head. "Shh! Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Kara's voice was taut with unease. Megan strained her ears, but the sound seemed to stop as soon as she noticed it. She shook her head, brushing it off. Nothing. Probably just the wind. But they hadn't opened any windows. And as they moved farther down the hall, the whispers began again, so faint at first that Megan thought she might be imagining them. They weren't words exactly, but they carried an undeniable rhythm, a cadence that seemed like speech, as though a group of people were murmuring just out of earshot. "Okay, I definitely heard it that time," Eric muttered. "What the hell is that?" Megan didn't answer. She didn't know. Her flashlight beam swept over peeling wallpaper and cracked plaster, but nothing seemed out of place. The whispers grew a little louder. Kara whimpered softly, her voice trembling as she said, "We should leave, now." Megan hesitated. The sound wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to be all around them, bouncing off the walls and swirling in the air. Her hands were clammy on the flashlight, and her throat felt tight. She took a cautious step forward, her sneakers scuffing against the floorboards. The whispers shifted, their rhythm changing as though reacting to her movement. "I just want to see what's at the end of the hall," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "No way," Kara hissed. "This is insane." "Just stay close," Megan replied, though her confidence was wavering. She pressed on, the others reluctantly following. The farther they went, the louder the whispers grew. They weren't yelling, exactly, but their intensity made Megan's skin crawl. She had the eerie sensation that the voices knew her name, that they were speaking to her, at her, demanding her attention. She gritted her teeth and tried to block them out, focusing instead on the end of the hallway, where a door loomed in the darkness. "Megan," Eric said suddenly, his voice sharp. "Look." He shone his flashlight on the wall, and Megan's stomach dropped. The faded wallpaper wasn't just peeling. Beneath it, there were symbols. They weren't scribbled in pencil or marker. They were carved directly into the plaster. They spiraled and twisted in ways that hurt her eyes if she stared too long. Megan's flashlight followed the shapes down the wall, where they snaked toward the door at the end of the hall. "What is this?" Kara whispered, her voice shaking. Megan didn't answer. She was focused on the door. The symbols around it seemed to pulse, their edges catching the light in a way that made them look almost alive. The whispers swelled in her ears, louder and louder, until she thought she might scream just to drown them out. Her hand hovered over the door handle. "Megan, stop," Kara begged, tugging on her arm. "Let's get out of here, we have to go." Megan hesitated. The whispers were deafening now, an overwhelming chorus of unintelligible words that made her chest tighten. But there was something beyond the fear, something pulling her forward, urging her to open the door. She turned the handle. The door creaked open, the whispers surging into a crescendo as the darkness beyond it yawned open. Megan shone her flashlight into the void. For a split second, she thought she saw something moving, shadows twisting and writhing just beyond the beam's reach. Then the whispers stopped, and silence crashed over them like a wave. "What is it?" Eric asked, his voice barely audible. Megan's flashlight shook in her hand. "I don't know," she murmured. The room beyond was empty, but it felt wrong. The air was heavier here, almost suffocating. She took a hesitant step inside, and that's when the door slammed shut behind them. The slam of the door made all three of them jump. Megan's flashlight dropped from her hand, the sound of it hitting the floor sharp and final. For a moment, no one moved. The air inside the room felt heavier, more oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in. "What the hell was that?" Kara hissed, her voice trembling. She scrambled to pick up Megan's flashlight and thrust it back into her hand. Megan was still staring at the door. She hadn't seen anyone slam it. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a profound, eerie silence. Even their breathing felt too loud. Eric stepped forward, trying the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. He yanked it harder, but it was no use. "It stuck," he muttered, his usual confidence beginning to crack. Megan glanced around the room. It wasn't large, just a small, square space with a single window. The walls were bare, the floorboards warped and uneven. It looked like an ordinary, neglected room, but the atmosphere was anything but normal. Her heart was racing, her skin clammy. She felt as if they'd just crossed an invisible line, stepping into a place they weren't supposed to be. "I don't like this," Kara said, hugging herself tightly. "Why did we come in here?" Eric didn't respond. He was already examining the window. "We can climb out," he said, though his voice lacked its usual swagger. He pushed against the glass, but it didn't budge. "It's painted shut or something. Are you kidding me?" Kara asked, panic creeping into her tone. "I'm not kidding!" Eric snapped, his frustration bleeding through. He pounded his fist on the glass. It didn't so much as rattle. Megan turned her attention to the walls. They were bare, except for faint, faded scratches, like the ones she'd seen downstairs. She shone her flashlight on them and noticed something peculiar. The scratches formed patterns, spirals, and lines that seemed almost deliberate. She couldn't shake the feeling that the room was watching them. "I think," Megan began, but she was cut off by a sound. It was faint at first, like distant shuffling. All three of them froze, listening. The sound grew louder. It was coming from beyond the walls, no, beneath them. A steady, deliberate scraping noise that made Megan's skin crawl. It moved slowly, almost rhythmically. "Do you hear that?" Kara whispered, her voice barely audible. Megan nodded, but she didn't dare speak. The noise was getting closer, rising up from the floor, circling them. Eric, clearly unnerved, pointed his flashlight at the boards beneath his feet. "It's just an animal," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "A rat or something." But Megan wasn't convinced. The sound was too deliberate, too slow. It circled again, then stopped. Dead silence returned, pressing in on all sides. And then Eric was gone. It happened so quickly that Megan couldn't process it. One moment, he was standing a few feet away, his flashlight sweeping the room. The next, he wasn't. There was no sound, no flash of movement, just an empty space where he'd been standing. His flashlight lay on the floor, the beam shining weakly against the wall. "Eric?" Kara's voice was sharp with panic. She stumbled forward, grabbing at the empty air where he'd been. "Eric!" Megan's mind raced. She spun around, her own flashlight trembling in her hand, illuminating every corner of the room. There was no door, no trap door, no way he could have left. But he was gone. Kara started pounding on the walls. "Eric, stop messing around! Where are you?" Megan knelt down and picked up his flashlight, shining it across the floorboards. Nothing, no sign of him. "He was right here," she said, her voice shaky. "He didn't go anywhere. He couldn't have gone anywhere." Kara turned on Megan, her face pale and terrified. "What do you mean? He couldn't have gone anywhere. He's not here, is he?" Megan didn't have an answer. She just shook her head, staring at the spot where Eric had been standing. Her flashlight beam caught the faint scratches on the floor, those spirals and patterns that now seemed to shift ever so slightly under the light. The whispers started again. This time they were louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around, from the very walls, pressing in on them. Megan's chest tightened, and she felt the icy weight of fear settle over her. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the whispers stopped. The room was silent again. But Eric was still gone, leaving Megan and Kara alone in the suffocating dark. The house was deathly silent now, but Megan's nerves refused to settle. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the house itself was pressing down on them. Kara stood by the window, shaking, her hands gripping the wooden sill. She tried prying it open in a panic when Eric vanished, but the window wouldn't budge. Now, she just stared out into the night, her breathing ragged. Megan approached cautiously, her flashlight flickering with every step. She was afraid to say it out loud, but she knew what Kara was thinking. Maybe Eric was outside. Maybe he had somehow gotten out and was waiting for them in the overgrown yard. But that didn't make sense. She hadn't heard the window break, hadn't seen the glass shift. He had disappeared right there, inside the room, in front of them. Megan forced herself to push down the rising panic. "Kara," she said softly, "what do you see?" Kara didn't respond right away. She was staring intently at something outside, her breath fogging the glass. "There's someone out there," she said finally, her voice a fragile thread. Megan's heart leapt into her throat. "What do you mean?" "By the edge of the yard," Kara whispered. "Just standing there." Megan quickly joined her at the window, squinting into the dark. At first she saw nothing, just the yard below, tangled with weeds and littered with broken branches. The moonlight cast faint, silvery patterns over the scene, but everything looked still. Then she saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the edge of the yard, partially obscured by the gnarled remains of an old oak tree. The silhouette was motionless, blending almost perfectly into the shadows. It was too far away to make out details, but Megan's stomach turned. There was something off about the way it stood, too rigid, too upright, as though it were a statue instead of a person. "Do you think it's Eric?" Kara asked, her voice trembling with hope and fear. "Maybe he got out somehow. Maybe." "No," Megan said quietly. Her gut told her it wasn't Eric. Her flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, the figure seemed closer. She blinked, gripping the flashlight tighter, but it was back where it had been. "You saw that, right?" Kara's voice was nearly a whimper. Megan nodded, her throat dry. She leaned closer to the window, her breath forming small clouds on the glass. The figure remained motionless, but Megan could feel its presence. It was watching them. She couldn't explain how she knew, but she felt it deep in her bones. The same pull that had lured her into the house now urged her to step away from the window, to hide from that terrible, unmoving gaze. "What do we do?" Kara whispered, her voice barely audible. Megan didn't answer. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Could it be some kind of trick of the light? A shadow cast by a tree or an old piece of furniture left in the yard? But even as she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was real and that it was waiting for something. The whispering started again, soft and insidious. Kara gasped, stumbling back from the window. Megan froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. The whispers didn't sound distant this time. They were close. They seemed to come from the very walls surrounding them. Words she couldn't understand, muttered in a low, rhythmic chant. Kara clapped her hands over her ears, shaking her head. "No, no, no," she whimpered. "What is this? What's happening?" Megan wanted to tell her it would be okay, but the words wouldn't come. She turned her gaze back to the window, searching for the figure. It was gone. Her stomach flipped, and she felt her legs go weak. "It's not there anymore," she said aloud, though her voice was barely more than a whisper. Kara dropped her hands from her ears, her eyes wide. "What do you mean it's not there? Where did it go?" Megan scanned the yard again, her flashlight beam darting over the tall grass, the twisted tree, the broken fence. Nothing. The figure had vanished as suddenly as Eric had, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. Megan's eyes traveled back to the window, and she caught her reflection. The glass was dirty and warped, but she could see herself and Kara standing side by side. And behind them, just barely visible in the reflection, was the figure. Inside the room, standing near the doorway. Megan spun around, her flashlight beam swinging wildly across the walls. The room was empty. "Get away from the window," she said sharply. She grabbed Kara's arm, pulling her back. The whispers grew louder, filling her head with an incomprehensible chorus of voices. She thought she heard her own name among them. The figure in the reflection hadn't moved, but it hadn't gone away either. It was closer now, as though it had stepped just a few inches closer to them. Megan stared at the empty room, then back at the glass. The reflection still showed the figure, still perfectly still, still watching. "We have to leave," she said, her voice rising. "We have to get out of here." "But how?" Kara's voice cracked. "The door's locked, the window." "I don't care." Megan snapped. "We'll break it if we have to. Just stay close to me. Don't look away." Kara nodded, her face pale, and they edged toward the door. The whispers swelled, and Megan thought she saw the figure move again, just the slightest shift in its stance, like it was leaning forward. She refused to look directly at it. Instead, she kept her eyes on the door, on Kara, on anything that wasn't the figure. But no matter where she looked, she could feel it. It was there, watching, waiting, and getting closer. Megan didn't sleep for days after seeing the figure in the house. Every time she closed her eyes, it was there, still, silent, waiting. She stopped visiting the house, stopped talking about it altogether, but the pull never left her. The whispers seemed to follow her home, faint and almost imperceptible at first, then growing louder in the dead of night. Shadows crept in the corners of her vision. The mirror in her bedroom seemed off, like the one in the old house, but Megan refused to look into it for too long. She didn't want to see what might be watching her from the other side. And then Kara stopped answering her calls. At first, Megan assumed Kara just needed space after what they'd been through. That seemed fair. But as days turned to a week, then two, Megan began to worry. She called repeatedly, but Kara never picked up. Texts went unread. Visits to her apartment ended with no answer at the door. And her neighbors hadn't seen her. No one had. She was simply gone. Megan's unease turned to dread. First Eric, now Kara. The feeling of isolation grew, the weight of what she'd seen that night pressing harder on her every day. She couldn't shake the image of that figure, how it had stood so impossibly still, its presence as suffocating as the whispers that followed them. She couldn't forget the way it had seemed closer every time she turned her back, or the reflection that lingered when nothing was there. By the third week, Megan couldn't ignore the call anymore. The house was pulling her back, louder and stronger than ever. The whispers invaded her every thought, her every moment of quiet. The cold sense of something watching her never went away. She found herself standing on Harper Lane again, staring at the empty shell of the house. It loomed as it always had, patient and unyielding. Megan stepped through the gate, her flashlight heavy in her grip. The yard seemed darker than she remembered, the trees more gnarled, the air colder. The house's windows were still as empty and dark as sockets, its front door closed tightly. Yet it didn't look abandoned. It looked like it had been waiting for her. She didn't hesitate. She couldn't. The pull was too strong now. The door opened at her touch, as if the house itself was welcoming her back. She stepped inside, the familiar scent of mildew and metal filling her nose. She didn't bother calling out for Eric or Kara. She knew she wouldn't find them here, but she also knew that, in some way, they were here. Somewhere in the house's depths. Megan followed the whispers up the stairs. They were louder than ever now, their rhythm strange and mesmerizing. They no longer seemed incomprehensible. The more she listened, the more it sounded like her own name woven into the chorus. She reached the second floor and walked straight to the locked room. This time, the door wasn't locked. It swung open as she approached. The room was different now. It wasn't bare or dusty. It was pristine. The bed was neatly made, the wallpaper fresh and intact. A candle burned on a small bedside table, its flame steady despite the still air. In the center of the room stood a girl, her back to Megan. She was older than the girl in the photograph, but unmistakable. She turned slowly, and Megan felt her breath leave her. The girl's face was her own, not just similar, identical. Megan stared into her own eyes, her own features. But the reflection in front of her wasn't quite right. The skin was too pale, the smile too wide, the movements too deliberate. The whispers reached a crescendo, filling every corner of the room. The girl, her double spoke, her voice layered with the voices of the whispers. "I've been waiting for you." Megan's flashlight flickered and went out. She backed away, but the door behind her slammed shut. The girl took a step closer, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. "You can't leave now," she said, her voice low and cold. "You belong here." Megan turned to the door, pounding on it, but it didn't budge. She felt the girl's presence behind her, a heavy, icy weight. She turned back, her back against the door, and saw her own reflection in the girl's eyes. Her reflection struggling, trapped. "No," Megan said, her voice shaking. "This isn't real." "Oh, it's very real," the girl replied, reaching out a pale hand. "You've always been part of the house. You just didn't know it until now." The whispers grew louder, a storm of sound. Megan's thoughts blurred, her mind clouded. She felt herself losing hold of who she was, where she was. The house seemed to fold in on her, the walls pressing closer, the whispers drowning out her own voice. And then it was silent. When the townsfolk passed by the old house on Harper Lane, they swore they could still hear whispers if the wind blew just right. They spoke of shadows in the windows, of strange lights at night. No one went near it anymore, and eventually it faded back into legend. But every now and then, someone would claim to see a girl at the window, a girl who looked like someone they knew, a girl who seemed to be waiting for something or someone to come inside.